In Level Cross, North Carolina, a crossroads community so small it barely qualifies as a town, there's a compound that's been the operating headquarters of one family's racing dynasty since 1949. Part of it is open to the public. A museum, neat rows of championship cars, glass cases of trophies. But behind that public face sits decades of accumulated history that Richard Petty, the winningest driver NASCAR has ever produced, has spent most of his life keeping mostly to himself. Not because it's worth a fortune, though pieces of it are, but because, in his own words, nobody thought to save any of it in the first place, and by the time it mattered, most of it was already gone. This is a story of what got kept, what got lost, and what that says about a man who won more races than anyone in the history of his sport and still, somehow, treats his own history like something private. Before you can understand why Richard Petty's relationship with his own memorabilia is worth examining at all, you have to understand exactly how far outside the normal boundaries of the sport his career sits. 200. That's how many NASCAR Cup Series races Richard Petty won between 1958 and 1992, a record that remains untouched decades later and, by most reasonable projections, will stay that way permanently. The next name on the list, David Pearson, sits at 105. Petty didn't just win more, he nearly doubled the total of the second-best driver in the sport's history. He won 7 championships, tied with Dale Earnhardt and Jimmy Johnson for the most in NASCAR history, and he was the first driver to reach that number. He won the Daytona 507 times, also a record nobody else is within shouting distance of. In 1967 alone, he won 27 races in a single season, including 10 in a row, both records that have stood since before large parts of NASCAR's modern fanbase were born. He made 1,185 career starts and finished in the top 10 in 712 of them. These aren't numbers that got chipped away gradually by a string of great drivers closing the gap over time. They're numbers the sport more or less stopped treating as competitive targets and started treating as historical landmarks, fixed points that describe an era rather than a bar future drivers are expected to clear. Petty Enterprises, the team behind almost all of that success, was a family operation from the start. Lee Petty, Richard's father, founded it in Level Cross in 1949 and won 3 championships of his own before handing the family's iconic number 43 over to his son. Maurice Petty, Richard's brother, built the engines that powered most of those 200 wins. Cousin Dale Inman served as Richard's crew chief for the bulk of his career. All 4, Lee, Richard, Maurice, and Dale Inman, are enshrined in the NASCAR Hall of Fame, a level of concentrated family success the sport has never come close to replicating. That's the scale of what happened in Level Cross. And it's why what did, and didn't, get preserved from that run matters more than it would for almost anyone else in American motorsport. Here's the part of the story that tends to get romanticized into something it wasn't. Richard Petty was not, for most of his career, a man carefully curating a museum in waiting. He was a working race car driver running a business that needed to survive year to year, and in the 1960s and 70s, a used race car wasn't a historical artifact, it was scrap value and spare parts, or it was cash that could fund the next build. Petty has said plainly, in interviews given later in his life, that preservation simply wasn't on anyone's mind at the time. Cars got sold off to smaller teams and West Coast racers for whatever they could fetch. Others were stripped down for usable parts once they'd served their purpose. Nobody in the garage in 1968 was thinking about what a battered, dented stock car might be worth to a collector 50 years later, because the idea that stock cars would become blue-chip collectibles didn't really exist yet. That shift, from used equipment to irreplaceable artifact, happened gradually, mostly after Petty had already retired, and by then plenty of the cars that mattered most were long gone, sold, scrapped, or simply lost track of. What survived by accident as much as by intention, cars that were too tied up in other things to move, or too far gone to be worth selling, or that simply never came up for the kind of offer that made parting with them worthwhile. That's a very different story than a legend secretly hoarding his own greatness. It's closer to the ordinary reality of almost any working-class trade in mid-century America, where the tools and equipment of one era rarely survive intact into the next unless somebody stumbles into keeping them by chance. The distinction matters because it reframes what does remain. A handful of surviving Petty Enterprises cars, some documented, some less formally tracked, aren't there because Richard Petty ran a meticulous archive. They're there because, in a career defined by relentless motion and a business that had to keep paying its bills, a few things simply never left. Two vehicles associated with Petty's career sit at opposite ends of the story he built, and together they say more about the arc of his life than any highlight reel could. The first is the Plymouth Superbird, the aerodynamic monster Chrysler built in 1970 specifically to exploit NASCAR's rules on high-speed bodywork. Its pointed nose cone and towering rear wing weren't cosmetic. They were the product of real aerodynamic engineering aimed at reducing drag and generating downforce at speeds pushing 200 miles per hour on NASCAR's fastest ovals. The Superbird became permanently linked to Petty and his number 43 during a stretch when he was racking up wins across Plymouth's lineup, and it remains one of the most recognizable and sought-after cars in American motorsport history. Original, well-documented Superbirds with legitimate racing provenance routinely draw serious money at auction when they do surface. The second is much humbler. A 1957 Oldsmobile, hand-built in the family garage by Lee Petty and his sons, in the same general era when Richard Petty made his NASCAR debut in 1958. There's nothing glamorous about a car like that. It represents the version of the family operation that existed before any of the records, before the 7 championships, when a young driver from a town most people couldn't find on a map was still finding out whether he had what it took. One car represents the peak of what the Petty name became in American racing. The other represents the moment before any of it existed. That gap, from a hand-built family car to a factory-engineered aerodynamic weapon designed to dominate NASCAR, is really the story of Richard Petty's whole career compressed into 2 objects. It's worth being precise here about what's actually public and what isn't, because the two get blurred in a lot of retellings of this story. The Petty family's public-facing history lives at the Petty Museum, which Richard's late wife, Linda Petty, established in 1988. After a period in nearby Randleman, the museum moved back to the Level Cross compound in 2014. It's a real, functioning museum. Visitors can see championship cars, trophies, uniforms, and racing equipment, thoughtfully organized and open to the public. For anyone with a genuine interest in NASCAR history, it's a legitimate destination, not a marketing gesture. What's not part of that public collection is anything Petty and his family have simply chosen to keep out of circulation. Personal items, family keepsakes, pieces tied to specific people and specific moments that were never processed into museum inventory in the first place. This is a common and unremarkable pattern among long-tenured public figures. A curated, professionally managed collection exists for the public, and alongside it, ordinary personal possessions exist that were never intended for display and were never cataloged as historical assets. It would be inaccurate to dramatize that gap as a hidden vault of secrets. It's closer to the difference between a family's photo albums on the coffee table and the boxes in the attic nobody's gotten around to sorting. What can be said honestly, and is well documented, is that Petty has turned down interest from collectors and institutions in acquiring pieces of Petty family history over the years, and that he and his family have generally been more protective of personal items tied to specific relationships and specific losses than they have been of the professionally managed museum collection. Beyond that, claims about specific undisclosed contents are not something a responsible account should assert as fact. To understand why the Petty family holds some of its history close, you have to understand what the family has actually lived through, because most of it is a matter of public record, and none of it needs embellishment. Kyle Petty, Richard's son, raced professionally for roughly 2 decades and carried the family name into a 3rd generation of NASCAR competition. He won 8 Cup Series races across his career, a genuinely respectable total for almost any driver, and one that was inevitably measured against his father's 200. Kyle has spoken candidly over the years about what it meant to grow up in his father's shadow. Competing under a name that came with expectations no career could realistically satisfy. The event that reshaped the family's relationship with its own legacy happened in May 2000, when Adam Petty, Kyle's son and Richard's grandson, then 20 years old and already racing professionally, was killed during a practice session at New Hampshire Motor Speedway after his car's throttle stuck and he struck the outside wall at speed. Adam represented the fourth generation of Pettys in NASCAR, following Lee, Richard, and Kyle, and his death is widely documented as one of the sport's genuine tragedies, not just for the family, but for a sport that lost, in a single afternoon, a young driver many inside NASCAR believed had real championship potential. That loss is real, it's public record, and it fundamentally changed how the Petty family has talked about legacy ever since. Kyle Petty has spoken about it in interviews across the years that followed. Richard Petty has addressed it publicly as well, generally with the same restraint he brings to most personal subjects, acknowledging it without turning it into spectacle. It would be irresponsible to speculate about what specific objects, if any, the family associates privately with that loss. What's fair to say is that a family that has lived through something like that has earned the right to decide, on its own terms, what stays private and what doesn't, and that decision doesn't require a dramatic explanation to make sense. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Petty Enterprises, the team that had dominated NASCAR for decades, was struggling badly, caught in a sport that had grown far more expensive and corporate than the family operation it had been built as. Petty brought in outside investment and tried several restructuring efforts before the family eventually rebranded the Level Cross operation as Petty's Garage in 2008, shifting its focus to custom car building and restoration work rather than fielding a Cup Series team. That transition is itself instructive. A family with genuine financial pressure on it, sitting on decades of potentially valuable memorabilia, chose to build a new business around craftsmanship rather than liquidate its history. Maurice Petty and Dale Inman, both Hall of Famers, both well into their 80s, have been directly involved in restoration and recreation projects at Petty's Garage in recent years, including work rebuilding championship-era cars from original specifications and their own first-hand memory of how those cars were built. That's not a nostalgic photo opportunity. It's three men who spent their careers building race cars in that exact building, still doing that work, in that same building, decades later. Strip away the parts of the story that can't be verified, and what's left is still remarkable. A family that built the single most statistically dominant run in the history of American stock car racing, that lost far more of its own physical history than most fans realize simply because nobody thought to save it at the time, and that has since chosen, deliberately, and for reasons rooted in real events like Adam Petty's death, to keep a meaningful amount of what remains out of public circulation. Most of what gets called legacy in American sports is built to be consumed publicly. Hall of Fame plaques, record books, commemorative merchandise, highlight reels designed for people who were never in the room. Richard Petty built the most dominant career his sport has ever seen, and by every honest account, he's also spent decades quietly deciding that not everything from that career belongs on display, not to inflate its mystery, and not because it's hiding some elaborate secret, but because some of what a life like that costs simply isn't the public's to see. Richard Petty turned 88 in July of 2026. He still shows up at the Level Cross compound. He still wears the cowboy hat. By consistent account from people who've met him, he remains exactly what he appears to be in public, genuinely warm, genuinely present, and genuinely willing to sign an autograph for anyone who makes the drive to find him. What he's chosen to keep private, he's kept private for 60 years without needing to explain it to anyone, and that, more than any single object in any garage, might be the most honest thing left to say about the man behind 200 wins.